My name is Marcia Eli. I put together these programs for the Center for Brooklyn History, and this is part of a fall series called Talks in the Othmer. We're in the Othmer. It's a pretty magnificent room. It's sort of our farewell until we come back series this fall, because we are closing in about 4 weeks or so for renovations. And then we'll be back bigger and better come spring of 2023. So we felt that it would be appropriate to be in our most special space for these talks in the Othmer as we sort of round out this phase of the institution's history. So tonight, and I just want to also mention that the entire series, Talks in the Othmer, is supported in part by NYU 370J Project, which is Brooklyn-based. You may know it. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to be recording tonight and all sorts of other things, and we're really grateful to them for their partnership. So we're talking tonight, as you know, about a brutal lynching that took place in 1892 right next door in New Jersey. The book is titled A Lynching at Port Jervis. It's by Philip Dray, who's here with us tonight, and you probably saw the book at a table downstairs. You're welcome to flip through it, potentially buy it on your way out. Philip is happy to sign them. It's really an important read that, for many reasons, and you'll hear about them tonight, unfurling history that debunks a lot of people's assumption about what the North and South were during that era. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Philip and also our moderator tonight and turn it over to them. Philip Dray is the author of At the Hands of Persons Unknown, The Lynching of Black America, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. Also, There's Power in a Union, The Epic Story of Labor in America, and Capital Men, The Story of Reconstruction Through the Lives of the First Black Congressman. This is yet another, his newest book, A Lynching in Port Jervis. He is an adjunct professor in the Journalism and Design Department at Eugene Lang College. And tonight he'll be in conversation with Vincent M. Southerland. He is the co-faculty director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law at NYU School of Law. Prior to his appointment to the NYU Law faculty, he was the inaugural executive director of the Center on Race, Inequality, and the Law. He has also served as Assistant Federal Public Defender with the Federal Defenders for the Southern District of New York, preceded by 7 years at the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund, where he was senior counsel. Suffices to say that Vincent is an expert in racial justice, civil rights, and the criminal legal system. So please help me welcome them, and thank you again all for being here.
Great. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Marcia, and thank you, Vincent, also for coming tonight. There's so much history here in this part of Brooklyn. As I walked over here, I was crossing Cadman Plaza, and I realized I was coming by the site of where 130 years ago this month, Ida B. Wells launched her anti-lynching crusade to a huge audience at a place called Lyric Hall, which is no longer there, but was a venue for these kind of presentations in 1892. It's now the site of something, an enterprise I don't think Ida would recognize. It's called the Shake Shack. But this was a very momentous occasion. And it actually, her being here and being in New York was related in a way to the lynching at Port Jervis a few months earlier. Before we start with the questioning, I just thought I'd read a brief sort of preface about what occurred in Port Jervis itself, just to sort of give you some background. The black sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois, who, when he had an office on Fifth Avenue in New York City, used to drape a banner out the window reading, "A man was lynched yesterday." He once wrote, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all of this, so far as the truth is ascertainable?" Several years ago, I became intrigued by one of those frightful wrongs, the mob lynching at Port Jervis, New York on June 2nd, 1892, that took the life of a young black man, Robert Lewis. The incident was infamous at once, for it was perceived as a portent that the lynching of black Americans, a horror then surging in the South from the Louisiana piney woods to Tidewater, Virginia, was about to extend its tendrils northward. There had been a sharp uptick in these atrocities, 74 in 1885, 94 in 1889, 113 in 1891. The year of the Port Jervis lynching, 1892, would see the greatest number, 161, essentially one every other day. These were acts of white community affirmation led by white men fearful of change, of the future, and specifically of the increased advance in mobility of black Americans. It was a time when, in the South, reconstituted Confederates marched and rallied under the banner of the crusade they called redemption. Angry white mobs gathered before Southern courthouses, and judges and legislatures gutted Reconstruction's promises of citizenship, equal rights, and the vote. Lynching was driven not only by white insecurity in the face of black progress, but by white men's sexual anxiety, and by a related threat to male hierarchy, white women increasingly leaving the farm and the parental roof tree for cities, mills, schools, and factories. It was a world where all black men were presumed to be criminals, and all white men were the police. And as the journalist Ida B. Wells observed, where the word of almost any white person was sufficient to bring about a lynching. But what perplexed people up and down the Hudson River Valley was why a lynching had occurred in Port Jervis, a prosperous rail and canal hub proud to have recently been the first town in Orange County, New York, to install electric streetlights. It had a modest black population, just 200 people out of 10,000 residents. Certainly the village was not free of the typical racial bias and inequity of the day, but it had no flagrant past of violence along the color line. Of course, the Hudson Valley itself had a long history of human enslavement. In 1790, the first U.S. federal census counted 21,000 people in bondage in New York State, the largest such population in the North. New York City had more enslaved people than any other American city except Charleston, South Carolina. And the Hudson Valley alone was home to as many as 15,000. They served as farmhands, dock workers, servants, and gardeners, helping to maintain the great river estates. The two biggest slave markets in the country before the American Revolution were in New York City and Albany, notes A.J. Williams Myers, a scholar of regional black history. New York was not a society with slaves, it was a slave society, dependent on enslaved Africans. Robert Lewis was born just south of Port Jervis in 1864 and lived there on and off most of his life. His stepfather, Henry Jackson, was a veteran of the Civil War, one of several black men who served local black men who served the Union cause. Mr. Jackson was something of a celebrity, a gifted storyteller with an upbeat demeanor, whose name appears often in local newspapers of the 1880s. At his death in 1891, he was buried with full military honors at Laurel Grove, the town's scenic park-like cemetery. Robert, 28, was also well known in the village as the bus driver for the Delaware House, a leading hotel. He was responsible for meeting passengers at the Erie Railroad Depot with his wagon and ferrying them and their luggage safely across 8 very busy railroad tracks to the hotel. Like many residents of Port Jervis, which sits at the confluence of 2 rivers, the Delaware and the Neversink, he was an avid fisherman, and in winter joined friends in ice skating on the frozen Delaware and Hudson Canal. He spoke of one day going to New York City in the hope of being hired aboard an ocean-going ship. Of course, he never got to exercise that or any other choice, for his life was cruelly taken from him. It was alleged he had sexually assaulted Lena McMahon, a young white woman who managed a sweets shop, as she sat at noontime on June 2nd, 1892, reading a book by the riverside. tracked down by a posse of white men from Lena's neighborhood. He was seized by a mob before he could be taken into custody by village police, a small force untrained for such a calamity. Lewis was cursed and beaten by the mob. He was marched through town, his clothes in tatters, all the while proclaiming his innocence and begging people he recognized for help. His pleas were futile. Despite the heroic efforts of a judge, a minister, and a few brave officials and police, Robert Lewis was hanged on Main Street before a crowd of 2,000 men, women, and children. Ida B. Wells, who the previous month had been driven from her Tennessee home over her pointed denunciation of lynching in the Memphis Free Speech, was now in New York, writing for the Black-owned New York Age and beginning her historic anti-lynching crusade, a cause that would broaden considerably in years to come, largely in the hands of the early NAACP, whose James Weldon Johnson memorably termed it a fight to save Black America's body and white America's soul. Studying the known facts of the Port Jervis lynching, Wells suggested a consensual relationship had existed between Robert Lewis and Lena McMahon, which had been exposed by Lena's white boyfriend. Her thesis was never proven, and the Lewis lynching may have been spurred by other factors. A Memorial Day observance 3 days earlier had drawn hundreds of former soldiers to the town, where they filled saloons, emptied liquor stores, and heard emotional oratory that animated patriotic feeling, and perhaps stirred old resentments at having fought the Negroes' War. And though far from Georgia or Mississippi, many white Port Jervians may well have become convinced that in response to perceived Black transgression, no court or jury was adequate, and that they, as much as their Southern brethren, were justified in taking the law into their own hands. 50 years earlier, in 1838, a young country lawyer named Abraham Lincoln had named this highly transmissible contagion the mobocratic spirit, and noted that its presence was, quote, neither peculiar to the eternal snows of New England, nor the burning suns of the South. Neither is it confined to the slave-holding or the non-slave-holding states. It is common to the whole country. Today, the mobocratic spirit Lincoln warned of no longer haunts America. It is rather very much alive, vividly so. It stands against the rule of law and foments insurrection, vigilantism, and the abandonment of democratic norms. It fears the future as it hypes a mythical past, even as it strives to evade history's truths. In the summer of 1892 in Port Jervis, the local papers, while producing columns of ample detail about the lynching of Robert Lewis, were willing to go only so far in investigating what had brought about the murder or learning who was responsible. Big city reporters as well were stymied by the town's insular character and had little luck peeling the onion of local gossip and half-truths. Nevertheless, that the lynching had occurred only 65 miles from Manhattan stirred a national outcry. Southern methods outdone, one newspaper headlined its coverage. Another opined that Port Jervis had, quote, unsectionalized the crime of lynching. Many whites said that Lewis deserved his fate, but there was also shame, which was compounded when, after assurances that here, unlike the lawless South, the mob would be held accountable, Port Jervians conveniently failed to recall under oath who and what they had seen. This legal failure, the contradictory accounts given by Lena McMahon, and of course, a reluctance to whisper, let alone print, skeptical views of a young white woman's virtue, left numerous questions unanswered. And while there was grieving among whites about the harm done to the town's reputation, there was no apology or outreach to the Black community, which was understandably angry as it was terrified. The last official word on the matter, the coroner's verdict, like that issued routinely across the South, was that Robert Lewis had come to his death, quote, at the hands of persons unknown, a euphemism which meant whites had closed ranks in silence. It was the beginning of a collective hush that would, for more than a century, conceal the story of the lynching at Port Jervis. Okay. All right, so thanks for, that's a little background of it.
Yeah. Thank you, Philip, and thank you for an incredible, helpful background. Thank you for having us for this conversation. So I want to kind of dive into that background and kind of pull it apart a little bit. And I want to start, I guess, with asking you what it is that inspired you to write this book. what drew you to the subject matter, and how did you get interested in writing about this particular story?
Okay. Thank you. I had written an earlier book, as Marcia mentioned, At the Hands of Persons Unknown, that largely dealt with the scourge of lynching in the South. Even though in the book I did mention lynchings that occurred in the North and how they almost always, especially in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, tended to get a lot of attention because they were occurring where they weren't supposed to, so to speak. And so the Port Jervis lynching was one of those. And I think as years went on, that book came out about 20 years ago. I think as there were more, the murder of Philando Castile in my hometown of Minneapolis, St. Paul, Eric Garner, other cases of police murders in the North. I think the Port Jervis lynching and the way in which it served as a kind of augury, I think, of the fact that the nation waking up to the idea that lynching and anti-Black violence of this sort was not limited to the Deep South, but rather was, as Lincoln prophesized, was common to the entire nation. So I think that's really what drew me to the idea that it would be an interesting book to focus on, kind of do a micro history, really, instead of trying to treat the subject broadly, as I had previously, to attempt to treat it, how this occurred in one town, where, again, history even still wrestles with exactly how it came to pass. It'll probably never really be fully clear. So that really is what set me out. Also the fact that when I went to Port Jervis, at least when I first went there in, say, 2017, 2018, very much resembles a 19th century town. It's very easy to picture. Many of the places, the homes where people lived are still there. And so it was very easy to kind of imagine it. And so I think that also induced me to want to get in and cover it.
Yeah, and so I want to definitely talk about that and talk about kind of how the memory of this terrible and awful event maybe still haunts that town. I'm kind of curious if you can kind of take us there, and just tell us like what the dynamics were of Port Jervis. And we're talking about the 1890s. The lynching took place in 1892. Understanding it's the post-Reconstruction era, understanding kind of where things were situated nationally. But I'm kind of curious if you could give us a sense of what the dynamics of Port Jervis were like. What were race relations like in that town?
Yeah, thanks. It was, as I mentioned, it was a town that had a very, very small Black population, given the larger population. It was a railroad town and a canal town at that time. The Delaware and Hudson Canal had been in there for about a century already. And so it was a very prosperous place. It was the Erie Railroad's repair shops were there, which were this incredible industry that you could have seen from outer space. It was enormous and employed many people in the town. A lot of the Black community lived actually outside of town, about 1.5 miles north, in a settlement which was basically theirs alone. That was very typical of upstate New York and along the Hudson Valley at that time. A lot of communities, Poughkeepsie, Warwick, and so on, had African settlements that were nearby, and every morning people would come from the settlement into the white town, basically, to work, and then go home in the evening. And it was like a separate community, and there was often some sort of liaison between leaders of the settlement and white authorities in the town and so on. But Port Jervis in 1882 was a curious place in that when you read, the local newspapers, small town newspapers at that time, were like the Facebook, social media, and internet they were everything. Everything is in those papers. And I mean, the joke in Port Jervis was that it was harder to keep your name out of the paper than it was to get it in. Everything was covered, school children's names and how they were doing and whether they were showing up for school and this kind of thing. So there was a lot of, surprisingly though, there was a very popular Black baseball team, the Red Stockings, who were sort of regional champions. And whites and Blacks would turn out to watch their games and cheer them on. There were musical performances and dances in the Opera House, attended by integrated audiences. So that was why the lynching was, of course, surprising, was the town seemed as though it had a kind of a balance of some kind, um, to some extent. And so it wasn't like a kind of, and many blacks did live in the town itself as well. Many lived very close to where Lena McMahon, the woman who said she was attacked, lived. And so it was surprising in that way, in that it did not seem particularly to have, it had no history of flagrant violence along the color line. And I think that was fairly typical of the region, except that the black population was so much more small than it was in larger towns like Newburgh, Poughkeepsie, and so on.
Yeah, and I noticed, in the book you talk about how, the dynamics seem to be kind of fairly copacetic. I mean, everybody kind of got along. There wasn't a lot of controversy. I did know, like, in the course of kind of describing where the black people lived in the town, they were kind of relegated to an area that was, racial slur hollow.
Right.
And that name persisted up through the 1960s until people started kind of to talk about it, the name it is. So there is that kind of underlying difficulty, I guess, and racism kind of right there, flagrant. I guess thinking about Port Jervis, how it's related to kind of the mood of the rest of the country and in the space of the rest of the country at that time. I mean, we're talking about the post-Civil War era. Of course, it's about 30 years after the Civil War has ended, but there's still lots of veterans for the Civil War. So I'm kind of curious if you can give us a sense of what the general attitudes nationwide were in that particular era.
Well, yeah, thanks. No, it was a time, the black historian Rayford Logan has described that era as the nadir of the black experience in America. It was a time of tremendous, the redemption which was occurring in the South was basically the pushback against Reconstruction, of the advances of a more idealized time in the, say, leading up to the late 1870s. And so what you saw is a lot of, it's when Jim Crow became institutionalized in the South. There was something called the Mississippi Plan, which was a way to disenfranchise African Americans without openly violating the 15th Amendment, but by creating all these obstacles which are kind of nefarious, whether it's poll tax. There was something called the Understanding Clause that is a way to use for voting registrars to eliminate blacks trying to register to vote. And this plan was then copied throughout the South. So it was a time of, in addition, you had the pseudoscience of racial inferiority, which was published and spouted from leading scholars at Harvard, Yale, in the pages of the Atlantic Monthly and The Nation magazine and so on. It was a time when people are very conscious of a racial hierarchy. And so all these things acted to obviously reduce the status of African Americans at a time, 3 or 4 decades after they had the post-Civil War era, when, of course, there had been 2,000 elected black officials in America, in the U.S. Congress, and so on. So it was a time, a very low period. And of course, lynching was ravaging the country at the time. It was, as I said, they were occurring so frequently. If you go back and look at microfilm of newspapers of that time, there's never a day when there isn't some account of a lynching somewhere in the country occurring. So it was, in that way, a very bleak period.
Yeah, and it's interesting that it was so bleak because it follows this period when, you think about right after the Civil War, from 1865 to about 1870, you have the 13th Amendment, ending slavery, creating an exception for involuntary servitude. You have the 14th Amendment guaranteeing rights of due process. You have the 15th Amendment guaranteeing the right to vote. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which is providing forum for redress against, in the federal courts, where state courts would just not intervene when you had racial terrorism happening. You had the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, which one of those pieces of that act was Section 1983, which is a very popular, civil rights action now used today to vindicate people's civil rights. And so you have this tremendous backlash in that period against all these advances. And part of that backlash was this kind of racial terrorism that's visited upon people through lynching. And so I want to invite you to just kind of talk to us about lynching. I mean, you note that you note in the book, I'm going to quote you here, the depravity of the practice was such that while some were carried out in secret, many were staged spectacles, public executions with dramatic and ritualistic features that in part resemble both a picnic and an outdoor religious revival.
Yes.
And it strikes me just how the fervor for violence against Black people.
Yes.
And just so I just want to invite you to kind of just...
No. I mean, lynching was, of course, the most egregious, over-the-top expression of a kind of resentment about the future, basically, and a fear of change and pushing back against all manner of Black advance, whether it was in the courts, at the ballot box. And lynching became, partly because the North, after 1877, there was a kind of a Faustian bargain in that the North agreed to leave the South alone, basically. And this is where you get the kind of whole myth of Reconstruction, which was that Reconstruction had been a mistake, that it had been a case of federal overreach, and that now the South should be left alone. And so lynching became kind of the most extreme example of the way in which it terrorized the Black population. Of course, you could be 10 or 100 miles away from a lynching, and it was still, of course, a terrorizing, and that was the intention. And so the spectacle lynchings you mentioned were obviously it's difficult for us to imagine it, but these were sometimes attended by as many as 10,000 people. They would have special trains coming from large cities like Atlanta or Charleston, taking people out in the country where these atrocities were to occur. There was a huge buildup about it. The press would predict in almost like a schedule, basically, this is going to happen. There's a lot of euphemisms. There's no room in the jail, meant. And there was complicity on the top part of the police and the courts as well. And so Black prisoners, Black people who fell into the hands, were helpless, really. And these were large events. They were photographs until 1908. Postcards, pictures could be sent through the mail of these incidents. And so it really was, as Rayford Logan said, it was the nadir of the Black experience, and lynching was often at the forefront of it.
Yeah, and just to kind of double down on that point, it's still, even as we're talking about it and thinking about it, it's still hard for me to get my mind around the kind of level of depravity that it takes to do the types of things that people were doing. And, you talk about in the book, and we'll talk in a moment about the lynching of Mr. Lewis, but you talk about in the book, selling souvenirs vis-a-vis these lynchings. And souvenirs were like the person's shoes or body parts or hair or pieces of their skin, or it's just, and there's obviously no excuse, there's no justification. But the things that people were lynched for, I mean, if you ever have a chance to go to Montgomery and visit the Memorial for Peace and Justice that the Equal Justice Initiative has created there, there's a museum, and we were talking about this in the back, just like the things that people were lynched for. A woman complaining that kids were throwing rocks at her children, lynched. A person who done some work and had not been paid for it, knocked on the door, lynched. A person looking the wrong way at law enforcement, lynched. A person looking the wrong way at a white woman, lynched. I mean, it's just incredible. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit, like, where did the name even come from?
Where did what?
The name of lynching even come from?
It came from a man named Charles Lynch. It's related to the town of Lynchburg, Virginia, actually. He was a magistrate during the Revolutionary War in Virginia who, whether legally or not, would order the flogging of Tories during the Revolutionary War. And after the war, he was sued by some of these people. They lost their suit because the Virginia legislature agreed that he was within his rights to do this. but lynching became the term then for, lynching has had various meanings in history. Originally, it meant non-lethal punishment, like flogging, tar and feathering, driving someone out of town. There used to be, if you tied someone to a rail and carried them out of town, that's the origin of the expression, to be ridden out of town on a rail. It was only really after the Civil War that lynching resembled a much more deadly form. And starting in about 1880 or so, I mean, during Reconstruction, there were a lot of lynchings and murders that went undocumented. After 1880 or so, newspapers began to keep track. But I mean, it was the degree of depravity involved, as Vincent mentioned, the idea of relics and souvenirs of lynching. In Port Jervis, it was odd. There was a term they used called lynchcraft, which had to do with how, among whites, for how well a lynching was stage managed, basically. Was it how satisfying was it to the audience that had gathered, come all this way with their buggies and horses and so on? And one of parts of lynchcraft was this idea of souvenirs and relics, that you would go home with something. And of course, it was interesting that in Port Jervis, and disturbing, that this type of tradition just sort of spontaneously reappeared. You had small boys in the village would board trains coming through Port Jervis with what they claimed to be pieces of bark from the tree where Robert Louis had been hanged. And they would sell these pieces of bark to just passengers on the trains and so on. So that's what I mean, this kind of really the perverse practice was common and again, sort of followed the scourge of lynching to the north as well.
Yeah, and and also just I had to say I found it like so deeply, incredibly ironic that Black people were perceived as dangerous, as depraved, as not even human, and yet the folks who are doing these things embody kind of all those.
Yes,
feel like they embody all those kind of characteristics. Yes. And so we think about lynching as in terror, as kind of the white response to Black advances, as a tool to kind of validate the sanctity of white women and white men, and really to kind of this form of racialized terrorism. I'm kind of curious if you could tell us, like, what were the responses by Black people to lynchings
throughout the country.
Yeah, throughout the country.
It varied. Of course, it was terrifying. And what often happened was that the fervor of a lynching was such that even after the lynching itself had been completed, the mob would turn on the Black community at large. And this happened a lot in Southern communities. And so, of course, there too, it ended up involving local Black people as well, who, of course, many fled. I mean, at the time that Ida B. Wells was living in Memphis, after a lynching there, that of a friend of hers actually, that sort of set her on the path of being an anti-lynching crusader, she advised local Black people to leave. And many of them did. They left town and headed west. They said, you can't live here anymore if we're going to have this kind of police complicity with a lynch mob. Oddly, at one point, the men from the local streetcar company came to Ida B. Wells, and what they thought was that the Black people were leaving because they were afraid of electricity on the streetcars. And they sort of pleaded with her, like, could you write something to tell them that it's not really an issue or something like that. But no, it was absolute terror. And you'll find that in a lot of, if you read like the Chicago Defender from the early 20th century, a lot of Black newspapers came right out and encouraged people to leave the South and to come north. And among the many reasons, many were economic, of course, but one of them was just safety, lynching, getting away from, I just saw the movie Till, which is about the Emmett Till, and they do a very good job of showing how his family, as he was getting ready for this vacation in Mississippi, were petrified. because they knew that he was going to a part, the delta of Mississippi, where they were worried he wouldn't understand, having been raised in Chicago. And so that kind of fear motivated a lot of the Great Migration, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And Isabel Wilkerson in her book *The Warmth of Other Suns* talks about how that racialized violence and terror really led to people fleeing. And we think about refugees coming around the world, and we had them here in their own country, in the same way. I wonder if you could talk to us specifically about Mr. Lewis's murder and lynching. And I want to start by kind of asking you, so when I was reading the book, I was just struck by the source materials you must have had to kind of come across to gather information about this. And I'm curious, how you're able to separate fact from fiction, given the perspectives and who was doing the telling of the story at that time.
No, that's a very good question, because unlike after 1908, 1909, when the NAACP formed, they made it their business to investigate lynchings from the point of view of the black community, which was something that was not really done except sort of spontaneously by someone like Ida B. Wells, but not in a really organized fashion necessarily. And that was true in Port Jervis, was that there really is no record except for some very scant oral history and what you can read, that sort of reading the tea leaves, reading the white press coverage. There were 3 or 4 local newspapers in Port Jervis, all of whom covered this case, but they were all white controlled. And so as you read them, you have to really pick and choose what to believe. And as I was actually telling Vincent the other day, it's very frustrating as a historian, because there was even articles that end with the writer saying, well, it seems like there's something to this case we don't really understand, but and then you sort of leave off. And of course, you're reading it now 130 years later, and you want to say, no, go out and ask some more questions. But at that time, the local police force, of course, they were really just moonlighting people who encouraged their neighbors when they got drunk to go home at night. They were not going to investigate the crime. There was a coroner's inquest, which is a slightly odd thing in that we don't really have that so much anymore. In those days, sort of the days of like a medical examiner, the coroner was not only there to find the cause of death, but also could call an inquest to investigate if there had been any criminality. So that really became the main inquiry into what had occurred. And there's no trial, there's no transcript of it, but in those days, the newspapers would transcribe as they went. They would take shorthand of it and then publish. Of course, that itself is a little strange, because you're reading some reporter's version of what was being said in the courtroom. But the coroner's inquest, of course, it's a strange kind of legal process in that there's no cross-examination involved, at least at that time. And it could not indict anybody. All it could do was make recommendations. So basically what happened is, it was a very small town. Many of the people who were on the jury were actually people who had probably been in the mob itself. And so after those who dared speak up and accuse their neighbors of having been culpable, then those who'd been accused got up in the witness chair themselves and basically denied everything that had been said and claimed that they were elsewhere, or that they'd been trying to stop the lynching. So basically at the end, it was sort of a null case. And the coroner had no choice but to say, as I mentioned in my little speech, that Robert Lewis died at the hands of persons unknown. In other words, there's no there, basically. But obviously, everybody in the town knew who it was, and there was a kind of an ongoing bit of retribution about certain people who would not let go of their accusation, and how they were then chastised and called out for it.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the lynching itself and kind of what preceded it. How did it kind of unfold? You talked about earlier on, Mr. Lewis, the son of a veteran,
Right.
Was someone who was well known around the town, widely known around the town. clearly had a number of skills himself as a driver, as a fisherman. And you mentioned Lena McMahon.
Lena McMahon.
And so I'm kind of curious, like, how did this all come to pass?
But it's an interesting question. The case is it's very hard to decipher what went on exactly, and you're left to speculate really about it. Lena McMahon was the daughter of a family. Her father was a glass blower. Port Jervis was a huge glass manufacturing center. Lena herself ran the family sweets shop, which was near where she lived. She still lived with her parents. She was 22 years old. She had a suitor, a young man named Philip Foley, who was a traveling salesman, sold insurance actually, and he'd come to town a few months earlier, and she was kind of smitten by him because he was very good looking. He looked like an actor from New York. He'd kind of been all over. Her parents didn't really like him very much or didn't trust him, but Lena was very much in love with him, and he cared for her as well. He eventually was called out. He was staying in a hotel where he was found to be stealing liquor. He didn't pay his rent, and so he went to jail for this. Well, that was the end as far as the parents were concerned. They said, you're not going to see him anymore. Well, then when he was released, they did resume their relationship, very secretive. And it's at that point that I think Robert Lewis, who was sort of a man about town, he knew everybody. He knew Philip Foley, apparently, I think was carrying messages between the two lovers, basically. Now, beyond that, it's hard to know exactly whether he actually also had feelings for Lena. I don't know. At one point, what really precipitated all this was that Lena had an argument with her mother about exactly what we don't know. I sort of speculate in the book that Lena might have been pregnant, or it might have just been the parental control. She resisted. Foley had come to the house. The mother had chased him away. Lena was heartbroken. The mother hit her, and so Lena angrily rushed out of the house, had her wound dressed at the local pharmacy, and then jumped on the train to somewhere, she said New York City. Beyond that, the case gets very mysterious. She claimed to have gone to New York, to have sort of blacked out and not known where she was. She mysteriously wound up in Port Jervis back the next day, telling this strange story. She claimed to have slept in the cemetery, the scenic cemetery, which seemed improbable. She then hooked up again with Philip Foley, as they often did. They met somewhere on the street, and she didn't want to go home. Her idea was that she was going to run away from home. What that meant for her relationship with Foley was unclear. They decided to camp out on the riverside where it was warm out. It was late spring. They could sleep on the riverbank because she didn't want to face her parents. And so that's kind of where the story takes off from. The next morning, she dispatched Foley to go find out about whether the rail agent would go to her parents' house and get her belongings for her. And while Foley was off on this errand, Robert Lewis apparently came to the riverside, and what happened exactly, we don't know. A young boy who witnessed the encounter said that Lewis had attacked her. She said that she had been attacked. Lewis had all his fishing gear with him. He then made off. Instead of running away, he then was actually found a couple hours later on a slow-moving canal boat, which was led by a mule with all his fishing gear, as if he was heading for another place to go fishing, apparently. So he did not seem like someone who felt like they had done something wrong and had to flee. In the meanwhile, of course, Lena, who was damaged, she was physically injured. Her mother then came down with other people from the neighborhood. They took her home. She was then put to bed. Foley ran off because he knew that the parents did not want to see him at all. And then what happened was men from the neighborhood were, of course, roused by this incident. They all knew Lena. They decided to go after Robert Lewis, and they caught up with him on the canal boat, captured him, brought him back to downtown Port Jervis. Their idea was to turn him over to the police, but already a mob had formed at the police station. And again, the police were not, there only were 4 or 5 policemen around. These were men who were, most of them worked other jobs. They were not really trained for this kind of, I don't think they'd ever dealt with a mob of any kind. And Robert Lewis was easily taken from their custody, even though a couple very, very heroically fought the mob, and then marched through the town several blocks up a hill, actually toward the McMahon house. And then the lynching occurred on Main Street. He was hanged.
Yeah, and you know, a couple of things in there that struck me as both interesting and really curious, and just completely macabre and terrible. So you write in the book about how at some point, I guess Foley, the suitor,
Yes.
was somebody who lived, or maybe didn't live, but tended to hang around the black part of town,
Yes.
quite a bit, and so there was some speculation about whether or not he might have. They certainly probably knew each other,
Yes.
you said, and because they
Yes.
did hang around in similar circles. And I guess at some point, when Mr. Lewis was captured by the beginnings of this mob,
Yeah.
he said basically Foley said, "Go ahead and talk to this woman, or
Right.
or approach her."
Approach her. Yeah.
And you know, what you point out is that he clearly didn't think that he had done anything wrong, because he would have had to know,
Right.
based on all that he probably knew at that time,
Yes.
what would have happened to him,
Right.
and therefore why would he be just kind of on the slow moving boat,
Right.
looking for another spot to fish. You know, you talk about some heroes in this story. And the police, as you say, were completely overwhelmed. Their billy clubs were not even long enough to do any damage, just to beat back the crowd. But you did mention there were a couple folks who did try and step in and stop this from happening.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about those folks, and maybe what separated them from the rest of the mob in some ways.
Right. Well, first of all, I should mention that Lena's father believed that Foley had paid Lewis to attack Lena. Now, that might be some sort of part of the truth. I tend to think, my own speculation is that Lena was kind of the driver of a lot of what went on, and that I think there was some kind of charade perhaps going on, whether he induced Lewis to attack Lena or to go see her. I don't know. We don't know really what happened, or maybe Lena owed Lewis money or something. There were many witnesses that said Lewis seemed very determined to go meet her at the riverside, whether to collect money owed him or because Foley had instructed him to do so. But whatever it was, whether it was, I think she would have had an interest to create some kind of diversion, perhaps win sympathy for herself. She knew she was in trouble with her folks and unsure of what to do, and so on. And so I think she might have instigated this in some way, although it's still not clear exactly what happened. In terms of the heroes, there was one police officer named Simon Yapel who was almost single-handedly trying to beat down the mob. And many times they took his baton away and beat him with it. He got back up, got it back. Another person was a man named Judge Crane, who was the older brother of the novelist Stephen Crane. And the lynch mob came right by his house. And he ran out, and he was a very judge, kind of a respected person in the community. He just thought his presence alone might be enough if he told people to stop. But he had a little success, but he was also sort of shoved aside. And several other people, the president of the village, a cleric or two also tried to get in, a doctor. All of them eventually, though, were kind of pushed aside, and they were unable really to fight back against the mob.
And so just a couple more questions. So I'm kind of curious just to get your sense, and you describe in the book kind of what the fallout was from this lynching. What was the kind of the national public response? Because you do note that it did make waves in terms of national news. The local public response, and even thinking about the response in Port Jervis itself. So I'm kind of curious if you can give us a sense of that.
Yeah, no, I mean, the most important thing was the national response to it. I mean, for Port Jervis, it became kind of a byword, much as in later years, the way like the name Birmingham or other place like that might take on certain connotation. Port Jervis became this place where this act of vicious intolerance had occurred. It was in New York State, of course, and it threw people because, of course, many New Yorkers and people in New England and the Northeast generally thought of this region as a place where these things didn't happen. Of course, that wasn't true because they had happened in the past, as long back as the 18th century. But at least in that generation of the 1890s, when lynching was seen as a Southern depravity, the idea that it would occur almost in exactly the same manner as it would have occurred in Anniston, Alabama, say, shocked a lot of people. The big city papers all dispatched reporters immediately to Port Jervis to try to find out what had happened. As far away as California, there were articles written about it and so on. And it was a kind of like I said, sort of an augury, really, of there would be many other cases in the next, say, 20 years of northern lynchings, and all of them would have, in a way, a kind of an echo of this same effect. But Port Jervis was, in a way, one of the first, maybe the first one, to send that ripple through the country of this happened right near New York City. This happened in a very, what it was thought to be a law-abiding, cosmopolitan part of the country. So that was the national reaction. Locally, I think they went through a lot of different stages of both being regretful, being vindictive. He deserved it. As you can imagine, there were many, many horrible opinions that came their way as well. That, oh, you look at the money you saved. You didn't have to have an investigation or a trial. A lot of these things came up often with lynching. That this was a needed reform, so to speak, or the other, often from religious voices saying, we should be deeply ashamed and so on. Eventually, I think overall, though, my sense of it is that, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, that eventually the town sort of just tacitly agreed to move on. And very soon, within a year or two, it was not spoken of very much. And that really carried on for more than a century. When I went to Port Jervis for the first time to look into the story in, say, 2017, 2018, many people had never heard of it. People who lived a block away from the lynching site, both white and black people, had either had some vague sense of it or did not know about it. And so that's how deeply this kind of collective hush settled over the case. In long term, that really sort of became the reaction. As Vincent mentioned before, the town of Port Jervis did have this undertow of racial animosity. And even into the mid-20th century, there were certain restaurants, certain beaches that it was understood black people did not go to in Port Jervis. And as you mentioned, the name for the settlement was still in use, the unfortunate name for the black settlement into, say, the 1960s. So it had that, there was that sense in a way. And I think also because the town itself, like many industrial towns in the region, suffered a lot of, economically it suffered starting in the 1960s. The railroad left, a lot of the industries closed, the freeway passed it by. And so I think many of the whites in the town felt still aggrieved in a way that the town was dying anyway, and this was not something that and that was the reaction I felt I got when I first went there. Basically that, to bring it up was almost like, why are you piling on, in a sense.
Yeah. I was struck in reading the book just about a few things, and just to reflect on some of the things you just said. The kind of almost rabid effort to find justifications for what they had done, right? Now women in Port Jervis don't have to worry about walking down the street, being molested by men. The fact that we've now struck fear in the hearts of anyone who would dare to commit any crimes against our people. There was a fight at one point over the tree where the lynching had happened, and some effort to save the tree. The irony being that you'd hung a person from that tree and killed them, and so there was that. And then the kind of effort to impose some summary process, the coroner's inquest, or thinking about ways in which to use the legal system to cleanse the memory of what had happened and to almost erase it. And for me, when I was reading through the book, what came to mind a lot for me was this notion of memory, right? And I mean, and how we think about collective memory, how we choose as a country to forget and fail to confront some of the challenges. I mean, I think you describe. I mean, you note again, just to read something you wrote about lynching, has this perverse relation to recorded history for obfuscation is central to its purpose. The so-called people's justice is meant to leave no trace of its operation. It features no lawyers' arguments, no objections, no trial transcripts or rulings from the bench. This determined forgetting has meant that each successive generation of silence means less information about what happened to Robert Lewis. And like I said, you have all these mechanisms that are designed to limit the scope of our memory. And so, I want to kind of invite you to talk about that frame of memory and what do you think is lost, what was lost by us failing to kind of recollect what happened there, and I guess what you found when you went to the town, and I know, and kind of how the town has responded to the memory of what happened.
No, thanks. It's interesting. I have a theory that even when a place, as Vincent just described, a place like Port Jervis that over several generations basically forgot about this incident, yet in a way it was always there. And whether people were conscious of it or not, I always felt that there was a presence of it in a certain way. And I can't help but feel that a town like Port Jervis that now wants to rejuvenate itself basically in every other way, I almost feel like this kind of acknowledgement is also important, that kind of recognition that there is something of value in that kind of acknowledgement. And I do think that process has begun in Port Jervis to some extent now, largely thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, the summer of 2020. I was in Port Jervis in June 2020 when there was a large Black Lives Matter march and rally staged by local Black women with the help and with the assistance, really, of some white clerics from the town as well. And it was a very broad-based outpouring, really. And I think that after that incident, the town leaders, the opinion makers, those who would be kind of sheltering or not willing to come forward earlier, I think suddenly saw that it was something had turned. And ever since then, just recently, I was there for a marker has been put up at the site of the lynching. There's an annual event for Robert Lewis. I even noticed the last time I was there that the local railroad station, which has a mural of the town's history, now has a picture of Robert Lewis in it, which is remarkable. I mean, to think when I first went there that the idea of that would have never occurred to me or to anyone. So I do, somehow they're teaching it in the local high school. There's an essay writing contest about it. Whatever these steps are, I think it's really important. And it's just in every way that I think we just know wherever this occurs and whoever works on these kind of efforts, it just seems eminently worthwhile.
So I'm wondering if we should open it up for questions from the audience, and I'm happy to I could talk to you all night, but I also know we have a lot of folks here who might have some great questions. So why don't we open it up for questions and
Thank you. So far, am I on?
Yes.
Okay. It's just a wonderful conversation to listen to. I never heard of this incident. And when you mentioned about oral history, and that it seems like it's revived people's desire to learn more about the incident, were you able to track down any members of Lewis's family who might have any kind of oral history about the incident and what was passed down to them? That's the first question. And then the second one, if you could go into a little bit further about the inquiry that was done, the coroner's inquest. because you mentioned doctors, a judge. I would think that people from the community, when they hear these people who have carried such weight, that it would be a deeper investigation based on, I'm sure they must have known some of the people that were involved in this and what
Yeah.
was said by them.
No, very good question. The first part, I'll say, I never could find any remnants of Robert Lewis's family, although his mother, who lived at that time in New Jersey, she was very much involved in the funeral and in the mourning and so on. And not only that, but she actually did something which is very unprecedented at the time, is she got a Brooklyn attorney named Rufus Perry Jr., who was a kind of pioneer of law. He was involved in the origins of the Legal Aid Society, actually, I think. In New York, they sued. They sued Port Jervis and the state of New York for $20,000. And the papers, of course, jumped all over this and said, wow, how audacious. I never was able to, I don't think anything ever came of it. I believe at the time there was something called sovereign immunity laws, which protected, in other words, a government, you could sue a government for property loss, but not for this type of thing. And so that, it never went anywhere, although to his mother's credit, she was involved in this with Rufus Perry Jr. pursuing this legal avenue, which again was something that at the time was a very new idea. Rufus Perry's idea was to create a kind of organization that would do this for other incidents of racial violence, basically impose some kind of financial penalty on communities. The second part of your question, which is very interesting, which is that one of the heroes was Judge Crane, William Crane, as I mentioned. There was a kind of aftermath to the inquiry in that there was another, I'm blanking on his name, there was another man in the town who was a kind of a right-wing orator and also a judge. His son was involved in the lynching, in the mob, which was a great embarrassment to him. And so when Judge Crane persisted in accusing this younger man of having been involved in the lynching, his father confronted Judge Crane. And it was kind of this battle of the titans in the community, these two leading jurists in the town screaming at each other in their offices. It was overheard by a lot of people. Basically, how dare you? You can't accuse this. You're accusing my son. The son had gone to Harvard and had his whole future ahead of him and so on. And it was considered, you cannot go through with this, blaming him. And of course, eventually Crane did kind of back down and say, well, why don't we give him a chance to tell his side of the story, which of course was the pattern generally, was anyone who was accused got to get up and sort of explain why it wasn't so. So it was sort of diffused, but there was an interesting postscript to the inquest itself. That's right. Yeah, yes, that's right. I'm sorry, Lewis Carr, and his son was named Raymond Carr. That's right, yes.
You were able to finger people you think were, the most responsible?
I'm sorry, you mean know who they were? Their names were published. There were 8 or 9 men their names appeared in the paper. There were 2 grand juries that sat, but neither of them, as far as I know, they did not indict them, and the case never went forward. At the second grand jury, it was like a rogue grand jury where they actually indicted the people who had been sort of the heroes, the town president and the other people, as just a way to sort of, as an insult really to the authorities. But their names appeared, and I think people knew who they were. I know that I talked to a local black man who grew up in the town and is still alive, and he said that when he grew up there, the names of those people were known, and their descendants were known, because it was a small town. And he said it was very odd to grow up and go to high school with people whose grandparents had been part of the lynch mob, basically. But in terms of any consequences, there were none, other than whatever kind of public shaming or whatever reputation, how they reputation might have suffered. Foley Foley hung around probably much longer than he should have. You know, part of the story was that the town blamed Foley largely just in a kind of vague kind of way. They just knew he was like a ne'er-do-well, that he had tried to, whatever, they associated him with all this trouble, whatever his role had been, which was always kind of vague. But he hung around the town. He eventually went back to prison on a charge, I believe, that he was accused of having tried to blackmail the McMahon family. Eventually, they let him out, and he disappeared. He eventually, wisely, they gave him a ticket. I think they actually released him early, I think, with the idea that he would vanish because he was just seen as a troublemaker.
Well, Philip, thank you so much.
Sure, thanks.
It's been a phenomenal conversation, and really enjoyed the book.
I actually would love to ask a question myself before we wrap up. And that is about mobs and hate. I'd actually like to ask this of both of you. We had a mob not so long ago here in our country. They were full of hate. And I'm wondering what you both think about whether the more things change, the more they stay the same, and so on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, to me, it seems like, yeah, you're exactly right, I think. I think some of the same reasons the mob charged up the steps of the Capitol are not too different from the same reason lynch mobs formed and acted 150 years, 130 years ago. In fact, people, when I was working on the book and after January 6th occurred, whenever people would say to me, well, how can these mobs, I'd say, well, now we have it on video. You can see the kind of medieval violence of a mob, which still, I'm sure like many of you still see the video. It's still overwhelming to watch. But you sort of get a sense from it how, when you read like about the Port Jervis case, how those few people were trying to keep the mob from achieving its objective, how futile it would have been given that level of violence, people willing to stab and hit as they were. So no, and I think, again, the basic foundation of it is, unfortunately, it's where we're at, really.
Yeah, I mean, I agree like 1,000%. The parallels between what we saw on January 6th and a lynch mob are absolutely striking. And I think the only, among the differences is, of course, no one was strung up outside of the Capitol, but that nearly did happen. And, the parallels between the attitudes then and now, the parallels between our view about what's truth and what's myth continue. Yeah. The collective effort, not by all of us, but by a significant portion of the country, to forget and not confront what was happening.
Yes. Yeah.
Seeing those scenes and thinking about those scenes on January 6th and seeing like the American flag waving around. And I think the thing that's the most striking to me is that we heard over and over again after those events happened was that this is not America. This is not where these things happen. This is not the country that we grew up in or were raised in. And the reality is that this is exactly the place where we are. This is exactly the times that we're in. And there's a certain permanence to these awful conditions that I think demands that we continue to confront that past and tell the truth as you've done in this book, so we can reckon with it, because that's what's required. So thank you for
Very well said. Thank you very much for having me.